Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast. I'm Eva Monheim.
And I'm Hal Rosner. We are both certified arborists through the International Society of Arboriculture. The purpose of our podcast is to encourage tree planting and proper tree care for our urban forests, which include neighborhoods, parks, and other open spaces.
We will also cover a myriad of tree topics, including the important role trees play in relationship to the climate crisis. Thank you for joining us.
Verdant Earth Educators provides dynamic in-person training and online learning opportunities for environmental and horticultural businesses. Owned by ISA-certified arborists and former university faculty, the Verdant Earth Educator team provides consultations on tree care and recommends climate-resilient opportunities for your valued green spaces. Verdant Earth Educators is all about seeding knowledge for success. Find Verdant Earth Educators at verdanteartheducators.com.
Monheim Microphones designs and handcrafts top-tier studio microphones and preamps right here in the United States in Hollywood, California. Their incredible line of innovative microphones and designs are used around the world by everyone from podcasters to top-charting record producers and singers. Monheim Microphones' unparalleled excellence. MonheimMicrophones.com. This podcast is being recorded on May 31st, 2024. Ben Shardlow is board chair for the Creative Enterprise Zone, a place-based nonprofit organization dedicated to attracting and supporting creative people and businesses in St. Paul, Minnesota. As an urban planner and designer focused on complex public spaces, Ben has worked on developing innovative programs to grow the urban tree canopy in challenging sites for over a decade. In the largely industrial creative enterprise zone, Ben launched the 100 Trees Initiative, a slow and steady approach to planting and caring for trees that seeks a sweet spot between the scale of operation a small nonprofit can manage and a long-term impact. In his day job, Ben is chief of staff for the Minneapolis Downtown Council and Downtown Improvement District, where he has worked since 2012, addressing root causes of a variety of public space challenges, including urban forestry. Welcome to the Plant a Trillion Trees podcast, Ben. We're delighted that you could be with us today.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
So, Ben, can you tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of where you grew up and a little bit about your background and your professional trajectory of sorts?
Yeah, I think I might be a relatively unconventional guest on your program because I am not a tree expert. I'm an urban planner by training. I'm just a tree enthusiast. I live in St. Paul, Minnesota. I work in Minneapolis, which is right next door. And for my day job, I work on growing the urban forest in downtown Minneapolis as part of my responsibilities. And based on the things I learned doing that work, I wanted to take some of those insights to apply to growing the tree canopy closer to where I live in St. Paul. So that has fed into the work I do as a volunteer leader for a small nonprofit in St. Paul called the Creative Enterprise Zone that has launched an effort to grow the urban forest in a place where it's maybe the hardest to do it in the region, which is a largely industrial area on the western edge of the city. So I have been learning a lot about what an individual, what a small nonprofit can do to try to support the work of much larger players to address the urban heat island and grow our tree canopy in places where there are some resource gaps.
Is it St. Anthony's Park that you're doing a lot of the work in?
Yeah, the St. Anthony Park neighborhood is where our project is located. The Creative Enterprise Zone, the nonprofit I volunteer for, is based in St. Paul. It's place-based, and it's really anchored in that south side of the St. Anthony Park neighborhood, which is, as I mentioned, mainly industrial hub for creative workers. And the Creative Enterprise Zone has existed for about 10, 12 years to try to just make it generally a better neighborhood for people because it balances a growing residential neighborhood, outdated industrial space, and then some significant kind of industrial operations. So it is part of the St. Anthony Park neighborhood, but St. Anthony Park is known actually in landscape architecture circles as a signature idyllic neighborhood. And that's really the north side of the tracks in a literal sense. That's the side of the neighborhood with natural topography, lots of trees, beautiful old houses. In our part of the neighborhood, it's a different story, and there's been very few investments in tree canopy over time.
So it's the actual industrial site that has curtailed the greening of that community there. So that once things start to shift over or transition from industrial to quiet office spaces, you would want to have more green. But you also want to have more green where you have houses of maybe lower income or people who have health issues, maybe even depression, because we know that greening can certainly help people with depression. And we find that higher depression numbers in those areas that are not greened. So I think that's really commendable that you're doing what you're doing.
Thank you for saying that. I guess the root idea that's motivating our project is that grassroots tree planting efforts often happen. They happen right where you've got motivated people, maybe with some resources and maybe with some time and connections. But when we're facing regional issues with tree canopy and urban heat islands and air pollution, it's kind of a core hypothesis of what we're doing is, can we apply that neighborliness to the next neighborhood over where there are resource gaps, where there are sites that could easily be planted if we could just get established trees there, if there's someone who adopts that neighborhood. In our case, to your exact point, kind of an industrial area experiencing a lot of turnover and a lot of multifamily house development. So edges that are becoming more of a neighborhood with a good amount of public and subsidized housing, and this interplay between different land uses that adds up to a neighborhood where there hasn't been a lot of civic drive to attend to the public realm.
And do you get a lot of buy-in from the people that are there?
We get a lot of buy-in from the people who see the need. I think that is part of one issue that I'm expecting we can get into in our conversation is there are ardent supporters for what we're doing. There are people who are really excited about what we're doing. And then there's the fact that we haven't taken the approach of saying, hey, who would like a tree and who would like to take care of a tree? Because you're dealing in many cases with international property owners, industrial uses who are not inclined or have not been inclined to think of themselves in the landscaping business. There's an interesting interplay because we've designed our program to use and channel grassroots support, but not presume that it's there, and not only get trees in locations where there's someone who wants to take on the responsibility long-term for growing trees.
Just to be clear, Ben, this portion of St. Anthony's as a neighborhood, is it specifically only industrial, or do you still have residential in there in some fashion?
That's a good question, Hal. It is a mix. There is kind of an edge of the neighborhood along a light rail corridor that is densifying. It's actually the fastest growing neighborhood in our city. And then there's an older edge kind of on the western part of the neighborhood that is technically part of our area, but it has trees, it has single family homes, it has a couple of parks. The area of need is not really there. So our focus has really been recognizing that in terms of a regionally significant but small and manageable tree project for a small organization to take on, focusing on the plantable space in the industrial area is really our kind of high leverage opportunity.
The goal then, one of many I'm sure, is to make this neighborhood more attractive and appealing so that businesses would be drawn, light manufacturing or whatever, to this area and establish themselves in that fashion.
Yes, I think that is correct. We do want a neighborhood that is more livable, that's more walkable, that's more healthy, just in terms of air quality and welcoming and all of those things. And in truth, it's a neighborhood that is not disadvantaged in the sense of economics. Mm-hmm. Most of the industrial space is full.
Okay, yeah.
And there is turnover in it. Our motivation is to make sure that as much space as possible is being used by creative workers and businesses, and that those industrial spaces kind of see new life, and that there's more of a focus on uses of this space that generate more jobs, that generate more active use, as opposed to warehousing and shipping and the semi-traffic that entails. So it's in part just understanding for all of the things that we want, for all the people who are in the neighborhood, there is a consensus that a growing tree canopy helps all of us. And there hasn't been the resources at our municipal level to do it. And most of the grassroots work that happens in St. Paul happens through neighborhood groups that are really residential. So we don't really have grassroots organizations that are taking on greening of industrial areas. And a lot of our city is industrial. A lot of our city is commercial. And it's really the industrial and commercial areas of our city that do not have mature trees. I'm interested in looking at how we can solve that.
You had mentioned light rail. Is that for human transportation?
Yes.
That's moving humans. Okay. St. Anthony's, I'm assuming then, is a stop on this light rail.
Yes.
And therein the strategy of improving that space. Got it.
Yes, we've got kind of the classic dynamic where there was a $1 billion light rail project that connected our two regions, major cities, our major downtowns, and the University of Minnesota. And everyone's excited about that investment, and we want it to spur more investment, but we don't want displacement. We don't want gentrification, the bad word. There's some space that has been sitting relatively underutilized. So that's part of what led to us exploring maybe using some of that underutilized space for growing trees in two senses. One, growing them in gravel bed nurseries. And second, finding more spots and planting more trees in that underutilized space, pushing what's possible there.
First of all, I wanted to say that I was there in both your cities last summer with the Garden Communicators. And I want to tell you, we had a great time. We had the opportunity to take light rail. And there was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to see a very broad slice of both towns or cities. And what I think I'm hearing you say is you really want to soften the hardness of your cities. You want to soften them so that they might not be as loud. They might be more walkable when you have cooler avenues to travel down. That whole idea of the enticing of the walkability of a community and the connectivity between one spot and another. And I think that your tree efforts are really important because clear across the country, all cities are taking a look at how hard some of their areas are and how much softer they need to be in order to make it more livable, more commutable.
Yeah, I'm so glad you were able to pay us a visit. And thank you for that observation. I think it's true. I think in general, we have a region that is walkable, and we've made some investments to spur that on and make it more possible. And there are some kind of expanding edges of that. And I would say our neighborhood is one of those where there's change coming. It's mainly good. But in this neighborhood where we have this great light rail stop, some great local businesses, some great housing development, we have a lot of hardscape. It's an intensely hardscape environment with streets that were designed for semi-trucks and large warehouses without green roofs. It's a pretty hard environment. And one of the realities that we're facing in terms of wanting both of our cities to be walkable is that it can be forbiddingly hot in Minnesota in the summer. I know that's not our reputation, but it's true. If there's 3-4 months of the year in which it's uncomfortably hot, then you can build a walkable environment that has everything except for cooling, and people won't want to walk. People will kind of instinctively avoid it. So it is a critical piece of the puzzle, and it's something where we're trying to drive that conversation. Climate change is, in one sense, this overwhelmingly large issue. We believe the science that microclimates are real. And if we invest in trees and other cooling strategies in locations of concern, particularly our walkable neighborhood, that can make a noticeable effort. A single mature street tree is as good as 20 room-sized air conditioners. We actually need to physically cool the space and shade the space to get the kind of community that we want, where people can take transit and walk to meet their needs and patronize businesses. It's a really underappreciated part of the next 20 years, I think, of the work that we need to do for our cities to adapt.
I think St. Paul has the right guy doing the right stuff. I have to commend you on that. The other thing I wanted to say is that you have a great nursery there, Bailey's Nursery, that I know your organization is able to get trees from, which is phenomenal because they work very diligently on trees that are going to be good urban trees. And that's another thing that I think is really critical, to get trees that can withstand that heat, that can stand the pressure and even the wind, because I was really surprised how windy it could be in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And those are the kind of things that trees will help with, most definitely.
I couldn't agree more. And yes, major shout out to our friends at Bailey Nurseries. They are a St. Paul company, and they have been our partners from the beginning. We're really grateful to have their support. And our project really would not be possible without the support from great companies that know things that we don't know, like how to grow really healthy trees like Bailey Nurseries does. And similarly, we've gotten some key logistical support from Davy Tree, which I know is a national company as well. They've kind of helped us with logistics.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. As a small nonprofit, we just don't have the trucks. We don't have sometimes the people power. And they've volunteered on all of our planting days and getting the trees in the gravel beds. So that's been fantastic. And then University of Minnesota is our neighbor as well. They are the authors of a great gravel bed guide and kind of a general repository of knowledge about trees adaptation, facing climate change, all of that. So we're really seeing our work as trying to, again, leverage and make full use of all the resources that are available to us in trying to meet our goals in this neighborhood.
Before we lose listeners to Googling gravel beds, can you tell us what you know?
Yes, that's a fair question. There's an alternate version of the story of my work for this organization on this project, and that is that I heard about gravel beds and I thought they were cool and I just wanted to do them. So this is all like figuring out where and how to go about that.
Yeah.
Without further ado, gravel beds is a model for inexpensively getting tree stock that can mature and get planted permanently at the end of a growing season after being grown in essentially a mound of gravel over the course of the summer. It's kind of delightfully not that complex. You get bare root stock in the spring, you get gravel, you get a basic irrigation system, and these relatively small trees with small root structures get in the gravel beds. And with all of the voids between the gravel, their fine root structure just goes crazy. And that fine root structure growth enables the trees to uptake nutrients and be healthier once they get planted in that environment in the fall. So bare root stock comes off a truck in the spring, you get it in the gravel, you water it all summer. And then the other reason why it's a really great option for community tree planting efforts is that literally a volunteer can go in and pull the tree out of the gravel bed. You're not moving a gigantic, heavy, containerized tree or balled and burlap tree.
Balled and burlap.
Yeah, I'll send you a couple photos. Like I have kids who are under 10 and they get the trees out of the gravel bed and they can bring it over to the spot. And it's logistically a great approach to take. Bare root tree stock tends to be a little bit less expensive. And if you can find a 10 by 20, 10 by 30 area, you can cultivate a lot of trees over the growing season and just kind of keep an eye on them and have one big community planting day in the fall. And it's relatively easy to administer. And it makes for something that, again, a small nonprofit can reasonably take on.
I will make sure that that gets put on the website, the gravel beds. I am familiar with gravel beds because I've been working with green organizations for a very long time. And the first ones I had heard about were Michigan gravel beds. So it depends on where you're from. Yours are Minnesota gravel beds.
That's right.
But you're right. They use them in Fairmount Park, too, here in Philadelphia, when they're holding things over. And you just can't believe the amount of roots that a tree can grow in one growing season, that they're going to be all cut off if you get a balled and burlap tree. They're going to be circling in the container if they're in containers. So to have them in the gravel beds, you have the full root structure and you can actually see it. So when you're putting it in the ground and spread it out over that little mound that you build up in the middle of the hole, you get to plant a healthy tree. And that's the best way to plant a tree. Most people don't realize it.
I agree. There have been a few kind of our stalwart volunteers who are there when the trees go in the gravel bed and when they come out, and you do get oohs and ahs because it's almost like a different object.
Mm-hmm.
They go in really kind of with bare bones root structures, and then they come out really shaggy. That again becomes a fun interpretive moment for working with community members about how we're taking this approach and why it makes sense.
Is the irrigation system automated or do you count on volunteers?
Good question, Hal. It is, again, delightfully simple. It's just a consumer level timer with a drip line.
Mm-hmm.
There's another learning that I would be remiss to not share, which is that the way that we started this program was maybe too clever by half because we were thinking, as I mentioned, we've got this industrial area. It's got a lot of underutilized land. Let's spread out gravel beds throughout this area. And then we'll get water from all these neighboring businesses and we'll get more visibility because they're spread around and we'll include more people in that work. But that meant that I that summer was maintaining 3 separate irrigation systems spread across a large industrial area. And sometimes people are thirsty and sometimes people see a hose and they disconnect it and they take a drink. I would not advise that. We've ended up landing on moving to one larger gravel bed right near where our office is. That's right out the window. You can see how the trees are doing. You can see how the irrigation system is working within a 30-second quick check once a day. It's not nothing, but in terms of irrigation, there's really nothing prohibitive about the equipment you need. We're just using hoses and drip lines and a consumer level timer.
And then getting back to the St. Anthony's industrial area at large, Ben, going into it as a planner, did you put together what we might call an urban forestry plan that is presented to perhaps landowners that are reluctant to hop on with tree planting?
There's an irony because this program was launched more on a hunch than in a deeply planful way. But it did start with just traversing the neighborhood and taking photos of every spot that looked like a tree could be planted. A critical part of the story is checking with the city of St. Paul's forestry department and saying, is it possible for you to plant trees there? And we are, like a lot of the country, in the middle of an emerald ash borer crisis where all of the resources of our forestry apparatus is going towards removals, stump grinding, and getting trees planted in those areas. So when we launched this project, there really wasn't any prospect. And the news back from our forestry counterparts at the city was, we don't have the resources, we don't have the time. So in terms of looking at a grassroots organization going out and spotting that there are a bunch of sites that are in the public right of way where you could plant a tree if you had the resources, becomes kind of a moot point because our city did not have the resources to go beyond just kind of addressing the emerald ash borer crisis.
Right.
So that gets back to that hunch. That hunch is, well, if we can find partners, if we can get some gravel beds going, if we can just start with 100 trees a year, we certainly know there's at least 300 spots where we can plant a tree, and we'll just go from there. The first couple of years, we really just focused on boulevards in the public right-of-way, where we knew it was publicly owned land, and we knew that our public partner did not have the resources to plant trees where they could go. So it's a little bit more of an iterative process than it is deeply planful, but we have transitioned to stepping across the property line and being willing to say, okay, a property owner, we're going to ask you if we can plant a tree on your large grassy treeless area. And we will ask you at the end if you'd like to make a financial contribution, but we're not going to premise growing the tree canopy in this neighborhood on them having to fund it completely. We're going to demonstrate that we have such a strong commitment to growing the urban tree canopy that we'll go it alone if we only have permission, not resources from the property owner.
As an urban planner, you're saying you weren't really planning, but you really were planning. And what I'm thinking here is that you're a big thinker. You're seeing things on the large scale. So if you're an urban planner, you're always looking at the larger scale. You're not looking at the minutia. And I think sometimes people get caught up in that minutia and they get traumatized and they stop and they don't want to do anything further. But if you look at it in a larger scale, it makes it so much easier to make things break off in little pieces so that you can work a little area and not feel overwhelmed.
I'm so glad that you see that, because that is also true. The way that I think about the 100 Trees Initiative, and by the way, there's a really fun contrast between the name of your podcast and the name of our project. Right?
Yeah, I noticed that as well. That's great.
We're counting your trees too.
But yeah, I think, Eva, you've spotted the fact that our project is a case study in setting a scale that, again, a small organization can take on in hopes that other people will be inspired, in hopes that other people will replicate it in similar contexts in our city and elsewhere. And there are other aspects of that. I've talked about the nice round number of 100 trees. That's something that people can get their arms around. If you were trying to rally community support to plant 27 trees, it's just harder to do. The gravel bed helps with that, kind of helping that scale. And then the other piece that we know is a challenge in our neighborhood and in both of our twin cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, is, again, climate change is here. Our summers are hot. And in these areas that are not natural, they're boulevards that are created on streets, we've had serious droughts the last 2 years. We're having droughts more often than not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if we didn't have an organized effort to water and maintain these trees, they would not make it. They would not make it through their establishment period. So that gets to the next fun, scalable element of this, which is that cities get those really fun, gigantic watering trucks, and those are pretty spendy, but we could afford to buy a 600-gallon trailer with a watering tank on it. And we have sent out volunteers and AmeriCorps members, and I've gone out myself many times to make sure that those trees have a watering bag filled every single week through the growing season. And again, the part of that that's pleasing to me in a logical sense is that it's a consumer level product on that cusp. Like, I don't know who else is using it, but I love it. It's a water tank trailer that can be pulled with a truck that you can rent, that a neighbor might have. It's, again, something where we're finding tools and figuring out that sweet spot of what we can really take on, understanding that if we water trees through their first 2 years of their establishment period, we're always going to have about 200, 300 trees to water. And can we sustain that over time? If we can sustain that over time, then the 10-year prospects for making really meaningful impact in this neighborhood are great. You need completely different tools to do 1,000 trees in a year. But it turns out with volunteers and with being pretty scrappy, you can do 100 trees in a year. And if you stick with it, that will lead to meaningful change.
Well, I hope you're documenting everything, because this sounds like grounds for a book. How do you start an organization without resources? If there's a will, you'll find a way. You know, I always like that saying because it's true. If your city doesn't have the money, where do you go next? And you seem to have found the way through the little gambit there to get to the other side. And I think that's very commendable.
Thank you for saying that. And that's very gratifying to hear because I know you both have your fingers on the pulse of what's happening nationally. And we are really proud of the work that we're doing. And for me, it was precipitated by years of going through this neighborhood, loving this place, and just thinking, gosh, if we're 5 years away from any prospect of trees getting planted, I don't want to wait those 5 years. I want us to figure this out. I want us to use trees as something that people can rally behind. Like people understand it, people want trees, but in general, people don't have full information about what's happening in their local forestry department, the resource constraints, the challenges, how those trees are maintained, how they're not. In many cases, there's confusion about what is expected of citizens and business owners in the first place. So I think there's real value for grassroots organizations and small place-based nonprofits to just go out and do something. Because without an organized positive effort, there's a tendency for people to just show up and frankly criticize the people who work in the public sector and even argue like during budgeting that the budget should be millions of dollars higher. But there's real resource scarcity with local government budgets these days. Mm-hmm. And then the people who are in the know might just know that they can call their local forester and give them an earful for what they're doing or not doing. But hopefully we're trying to find a way that's a more constructive, positive form of engagement for people to not just sit on the sidelines and observe that things aren't going as well as they could, but find something where you don't just improve your own property, but you do try to engage at that larger neighborhood level.
And that's what makes a community, right?
That's right.
That's what makes a really strong community when you're all working together. You can't do it by yourself.
Well, I like what this project is doing because one thing we've kind of learned over the years is this green gentrification is a conundrum. We don't have the answers yet of the practical application where citizens on one side or the other don't get compromised or hurt in some fashion. Whereas you're going after a largely industrial area and the mission is strengthen light rail, strengthen ridership so that people will look forward to getting out to their workplace. I like that. And it kind of takes the green gentrification issue out of the conversation to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think you're right, Hal. That's a very big topic, a very big concern. And one of the benefits of being a small place-based organization is that we can look at it in a finer-grained way. There was not a lot of housing in a large portion of our geography. And the housing that's being put in, a lot of it is long-term affordable housing, long-term artist housing. So it's not housing products that the rents are going to get jacked up.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's another thing where that green gentrification topic is a conundrum that can kind of stymie activity because people, they don't want to do the wrong thing. So it's easier to just do nothing instead of thinking, again, green gentrification does not apply to the street over by the railroad tracks where it's just small industrial buildings.
Right.
Let's get 30 trees planted there and let's get the surrounding neighborhoods to understand that addressing this gap in the tree canopy is going to bring down their temperatures and improve their air quality the next neighborhood over, and that we're all in it together in a regional sense.
Definitely. I'm a little bit fixated today on equipment and technology, so I'm going to jump back. Bailey's provides you with some trees. Are they providing bare root for the gravel beds, and what diameter are you usually taking them at?
We've actually landed on, since we're going to get more technical, half of the trees are bare rootstock that we get into a gravel bed. And because we're a small nonprofit, we haven't had the resources to double the size of our gravel beds. So we just get the rest of the 100 in the fall as containerized stock.
Okay.
So that's one detail. The other detail is that in St. Paul, the forestry department really doesn't want us to plant trees that are smaller than 2-inch caliper. So that's another constraint that we operate within. So we're getting relatively good sized trees and they're going out into a relatively harsh environment. And I know that's part of the logic. I'm familiar with the research that says plant them really small and then their growth rates will be higher long term. But you're also dealing with trees that are pretty vulnerable to vandalism, to damage, and it's pretty hard for them to get through the establishment period in the first place. So 1.5 inch, 2 inch is really kind of that sweet spot. Bailey can support us with those trees. The city's happy. We can manage them. They're not too heavy and everybody wins.
Sounds good. And then one other nerdy question for you. Your 600-gallon watering tank, is that accompanied with an electric or a gas pump, or are you able to get water into the gator bags without motorization?
That's another really good question. And it's bringing back a very funny memory of when we had a powered pump that we had on the back of the trailer and we tried to hook it up. And I got it going and the pump was deafening and it felt like it was going to skid off the trailer and we were dealing with volunteers. And then I said, maybe let's try it without that. And then the gravity of the water in the tank just was enough to get it through the short hose into the watering bag. So we tried it. It was another, again, finding that sweet spot because I could not be the one doing this all the time. It needs to be something where someone with a truck can go hook up this trailer, operate this safely, and it be as simple as possible. I'll put in a plug again that this is not sponsored content, but Northern Tool was the vendor that made this 600-gallon water tank trailer, and it was really fantastic. And there is a spot where you could add a pump, but in terms of, again, filling a 20-gallon watering bag, it wasn't really meeting a need.
Do you ever use the tree diapers? Because you can get around that whole gator bag thing very easily.
I'm not familiar with that, actually.
It looks like a little tire with a little hole.
Oh, I have seen those.
You soak it in a bucket and it fills up because it has hydrogel in it. And then you put it around the tree and then you put your mulch on top of it so that it's covered. But it absorbs all the rainwater as well as the water from your watering device. And that way you don't have a bag around the trunk of your tree, which sometimes can be detrimental in the heat of the summer. I was absolutely floored. I even used it for an article that I was giving information for. They work fantastic.
That's a great tip. We'll look into those.
Not to downplay the gator bag, but not every organization can get enough to fill that. And so it's actually refilling every time it rains.
Genuinely, we'll look into that because I'm focusing on the positive in terms of describing our project. There are aspects of it that are arduous, like going out and monkeying with a hose at a couple hundred different spots on a hot summer day is a hard thing to ask a volunteer to do. And that's where I've been remiss in not mentioning in terms of summoning the people to work on this stuff. We've tried a couple of other things. We've had interns from the University of Minnesota or elsewhere, or we've had seasonal AmeriCorps members working with us. And again, part of that is using that great program to find people who want to do public service and demonstrating that this is meaningful public service. I could also get into the challenges because you're dealing with either volunteers, interns, AmeriCorps members, and asking them to go out and do this relatively heavy work can feel like a difficult balance to strike where you're not asking too much. So we try not to ask them to do more than one day of field work per week or more than two or something like that. But it has been great. And there's also in Minnesota so many AmeriCorps host sites that we've had. And the AmeriCorps program lets people do community service at other sites and encouraging people to kind of bring a friend from their AmeriCorps program to come help them so they don't have to do this work alone. Again, back to our low resource model, we have to learn about these kind of approaches to finding people to do the work to meet that bare minimum level of care and maintenance for the trees to be able to survive.
Yeah, I'm all about, especially when working with volunteers, to make it as easy as possible and that they are having fun at the same time they're doing work. That's kind of like the sweet spot.
I love it.
I have another question for you. Tell us a little bit about the species that you're planting, because with emerald ash borer, it's already come and gone in our area, and it had left a monsoon of damage behind, especially in the state of Pennsylvania and around the cities and around the wetlands where trees are most needed. They just are gone. So what kind of species and diversity are you planning on and selecting for?
Another politically spicy topic in our work.
No argument. Yeah.
Emerald ash borer is political?
Yes. Well, and picking tree species in general to plant ends up being fairly political. So yeah, I will say part of this is probably easier because I'm a planner and because I'm not the expert on species selection. So I am happy to defer to people. The problem is that if I defer to three different people, three different organizations, they're going to tell me three different things on what kind of trees we should be planting.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So we have had some in-kind support from a landscape architect who is a volunteer with our organization. And she took kind of a landscape architecture-y approach to it and said, it would be lovely if there was a bosque of this kind of tree over here and this over here. And then the city of St. Paul has a list of pre-approved trees.
Okay.
And then the University of Minnesota gravel bed guide that I referenced before has great information about what species do well in gravel beds and which do not. So you got those things. And then there are some great resources out there, local and national, that help explain what species do well in harsh environments in terms of heat and air quality, or are well positioned for adaptation and climate change. So we've got some epic spreadsheets where we've tried to just collate all that information and say, okay, here's where we're landing. And then back to our great relationship with Bailey Nurseries, we go to them and we say, do you have these?
Right.
I haven't mentioned a species yet, but that's the process. And the process is the important thing. The process is solving for what's possible and what feels like a tree that's going to have a decent chance of succeeding in a gravel bed and in the neighborhood once it's planted. And then it gets to the part where we do have members of our community who want us to just plant native trees. And then there are people who say, you should not do that. We should be anticipating climate change and looking for species that are moving up into our zone. And we just need to have those conversations. And then it's also relatively easier because we are an independent nonprofit. And people can say, that shouldn't have been a hackberry, that should have been a Kentucky coffee tree or something. But we're the ones who are putting in the work to plant the trees. So we're kind of inviting people to the table, but in the end, it's not a question of whether a tree is going to be planted. We take input and then we do what's possible, getting the trees that we can have donated out into the neighborhood.
Those lists that the city has, are they available online?
Yeah, I believe that they are.
What should I look up under so I can put this with your bio?
I can send you a link.
Okay.
But I think it would be City of St. Paul, Minnesota approved tree species list, something like that.
Okay.
I did notice also, Ben, a real fine web presence where you have your 100 Trees Initiative dashboard. And it's a nice consolidation of the work you've completed. And there is a nice breakdown of species listed there. And also your mortality rate. You've got that right out in the open. We've heard of other organizations keeping that a little under the table. Is that something you're doing yourself, or do you have someone helping you out with the web presence and the data collection?
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Hal. We have a dashboard. I'll make sure that you have that link so it can go with the story. And it's another quiet revolutionary thing that we're doing, which is, to your exact point, being open data with this and saying, okay, these are the outcomes that we're seeing, and these are the things that we tried. And it is true, especially in that first year, in getting our gravel beds established and having those gravel beds spread across the neighborhood, they dried out a few times. And that first year of trees, a lot of them didn't survive. And again, we're not a tree planting organization. We've been learning this as we go. So part of the long-term strategy is recognizing that these are resources that are right out in the open and people can see if they make it or they don't make it. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to pretend as if people can't tell if things are working or if they aren't working. It makes a lot more sense to be like, we're having some challenges and here's what we're doing to address these challenges. And if you care about this, please work with us. Please come volunteer. So we can all own the outcomes that we're seeing for this project instead of judging projects when they don't work. So we have a great dashboard. It shows where the trees are. It shows what's happened with the trees, their health and condition. So I love that, frankly. I can only take so much credit in saying that I really supported this happening, but it was a project that our AmeriCorps member over the past year took on and recognized again, the city of St. Paul wasn't ready to go open data with their tree map. So in the interim, we'll go public with ours so that people can see the investments that we're making and the outcomes we're seeing in an open book fashion.
Actually, you're doing what a botanic garden would typically do. The trees that become unaccessioned are the ones that are dead, but they still are in the records. So having those records is critical because you can go back now and say, you know what, these trees didn't survive when we had a drought. Let's not use these trees. Let's try something else. Let's try something that might be a little bit more drought tolerant. That's where you really get your good numbers from.
I completely agree. And I know, switching hats to my day job, we work really closely with the Minneapolis forestry department as well. And we become such partners with them that we have access to Davy's Treekeeper software.
Right.
And we had a real challenge that we have not had great luck getting into archives to do that kind of analysis to say like, okay, we know the trees haven't succeeded at these individual sites because the data kind of recedes back into the archives and you can't see it. So it's another learning that I took from that work that we're trying to apply over here to be clear and open about what's working. And you're right, it should inform future species selection. It's certainly affecting the approach that we're taking with cultivating the trees and when we put them out and all of that stuff. The premise of all of this is, can we launch this? Can we be honest about how challenging it is and sustain the community support for doing this work long term? And so far, the answer has been yes.
Yeah, when you have data to back things up, there's the proof right there. It's in the pudding, right? You have the data and you can go back and look at it and you could feel good about where you've been and what you've done and where you're headed. And I think that that's really critical. And again, that's part of the planner in you because planners do think that way. I worked in landscape architecture and horticulture and worked with planners too at the university. And there was quite an interesting difference between the thought processes of everybody. And that is critical for understanding how a community can be a good community by having all these different thought processes coming together and really make everything work. It's, like building an automobile. You have to have everything come together. You have to have a bigger plan, but you also have to have all the small parts.
I agree. That is a great description of the approach that we're taking. And in part, it is, again, it's not the planners have all the answers. It's not the landscape architects have all the answers or arborists have all the answers. Like there's something better that happens when we all lend our shared and limited expertise with each other to try to address the gaps that we can acknowledge are sitting out in the open where we're not making progress growing trees in these places. Why is that? Who's in a position to try to make change there?
Right.
Before we let you go, Ben, I wish I'd thought to ask this a little earlier. Does Minneapolis or St. Paul have their own urban forestry plan or tree plan? Or is it something they might be thinking about doing?
That's a great question. I know that the city of St. Paul is doing a new inventory of where all of the trees are. And I know that they have detailed plans for what they're going to do in the coming years. I don't know that they would characterize all of that as a plan.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's kind of a similar story. And I'm either giving a good characterization of the truth or I'm just reflecting the fact that I don't have all the answers and I'm just focusing on projects that I'm doing.
Yeah, it's fine.
But in Minneapolis, it's again been more focused on getting through Emerald Ash Borer and finding the resources to do that. So I think there's planful work happening in both cities for sure, but real resource challenges where we're in the throes of a really acute crisis. Another thing to note is just that Minneapolis is probably a little bit ahead of addressing the crisis than St. Paul is. And Minneapolis is turning its location to Emerald Ash Borer remediation on private property, especially private property in lower income neighborhoods. So there was some of that national funding that just came through to address that. So that's one interesting way that the work is evolving. And I'm really glad to see it because it seems like there's a huge focus on equity. There's a huge focus on making sure that we're making investments where they're needed. Right now, that need has moved more to the private property side in Minneapolis.
The one thing that you should look into is the Urban Wood Network, which came about from the Emerald Ash Borer problem in Michigan, in Wisconsin too. They actually started an industry because of the Emerald Ash Borer. And they have sawyers now that bring portable sawyers into the city. They saw the wood up. They have stacking areas where they stack lumber, and it's reutilized and repurposed within the cities themselves. And it has created a wonderful resource clear across the country and all these different places that have had beetle problems and spruce. The fact that you can reutilize, but also create a whole nother industry. So some of your industry buildings that might be empty could be reutilized and repurposed for urban wood. I mean, that's another good example. We have that on our podcasts, but you're going through pain. And I will honestly tell you that there's been a lot of mental records on the bookkeeping of people who've lost their emerald ash, and it has affected them mentally. Everybody goes through a mourning process when there's loss, and that's a really big thing to have to overcome. And so you having your organization set up as you do is helping that mourning process to move forward.
I really appreciate that. And I do think it's entirely appropriate and right to acknowledge that this is an emotional issue for communities. And I think, especially with the challenges of the last 4 years, it's no small thing for people to have a sense that things can get better and that there's good work that's happening. And maybe they volunteer, or maybe they're just kind of quietly happy that it's happening. And that can happen by government or that can happen by smaller grassroots organizations or both. But it's an emotional thing for people to see mature trees that they've enjoyed for decades, years go away. Just because we aren't addressing those emerald ash borer sites, we haven't really been working on that side of things of tree removals. But it does seem like I think we do as an organization recognize that there's broader emotional resonance for doing a positive future forward community planting effort, because it feels like we're really doing something that's investing in the future that we can all be proud of. And the flip side to that is to say, in previous years, I've been a part of tree planting projects where it's more of that ceremonial photo op, like you go and you plant the trees and everyone's there for plopping the tree in the hole and covering it up. And then you look back 3 years and that tree didn't make it. I've been through that enough times that I'm sick of it, and I don't want that to be the approach. I think we need a lot more candid engagement with community members about what it takes for trees to survive in challenged urban sites. And that means watering, that means care and pruning. And we have the benefit of a lot of really committed community members that get that and that want to help us and don't want to be there just for the easy looking photo op. They want to understand what it's actually going to take to move the needle on urban tree canopy in our city.
Well, and I also think that you have really great models on either side of you from a state perspective, where you can go and look at their models and help to mitigate your issues much faster than they could have ever done because they didn't have the infrastructure or they didn't even have wherewithal to understand how bad it was going to be when the ash trees were gone.
Yeah.
And that's one advantage you do have over other states that didn't have that. It's really great that your organization is doing what they're doing. Well, we have to ask our favorite question, and that is, what is your favorite tree right now?
Right now, I appreciate the question. One of the reasons why we live where we live in St. Paul is because we have a majestic black pine in our backyard, and it has kind of a co-dominant leader at the very base, which makes for like a really great step up for my young kids. And it's just an epically great climbing tree. And it's kind of a sentinel way over our house. And my wife would like me to limb up more of the branches, and I want to see as much of it as possible out her windows. In terms of the tree that benefits my life and shades my house and keeps our energy costs down and makes me happy, I have to give a shout out to that tree.
Wow, that's the first time we've had a black pine. Woohoo!
I wish we could say we have black pines in the Delaware Valley, but we don't. They've gone away already.
The heat is just too much for them.
Not to take away anything from your choice, Ben. That sounds like a great tree.
That's the Austrian pine. We do have the Japanese black pine.
Right, not the Austrian.
And again, we're looking at temperature here, and we're also talking about assisted migration because of the heat. So, yeah, we covered a lot in this hour, and we really appreciate your organization reaching out to us to have you on. We just are thrilled. And like I said, I really enjoyed my visit to St. Paul and Minneapolis last year, and I was just enthralled with some of your oak trees and your prairie settings. They just take your breath away. It was really great.
Thank you so much. It was really a treat to chat with you and share a little bit about our work that we're doing. And I look forward to staying in touch. And I would encourage anyone who is listening to the podcast who's curious about anything we've done with this project. One of the premises is that we want to see if this can be replicable, see if this approach can help other places.
Right.
And we want to be a resource to anyone who would be interested in exploring that.
Absolutely.
Terrific, Ben. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Yeah, you too. Thank you both.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Plant a Trillion Trees podcast is edited by Andromedan Recordings in Hollywood, California.